There's a certain kind of science book now, which is anecdote, anecdote, study, 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 anecdote, study, 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 anecdote. And I really, really, really can't stand those books anymore. I wrote one myself. That's what the tipping point is.
I'm Michael Tamblyn, CEO of Rakuten Kobo. We sell ebooks and audiobooks, we make e-readers and apps for readers all over the world, and we do it because we love reading and we want to make reading lives better. One of the best parts of the work that we do is that we get to talk with authors about their books, as well as the works that shaped them as writers and as readers. This is Kobo in Conversation. My guest today is Malcolm Gladwell. He's a staff writer at The New Yorker, where for years he's written thought-provoking pieces that have turned into best-selling works such as The Tipping Point, Blink, and Outliers. He is also the co-founder of Pushkin Industries, which produce podcasts including Revisionist History and Broken Record. And his latest book, The Bomber Mafia, is a product of the convergence of those two streams of work, an audio program that has been encapsulated in both book and audiobook form. The Bomber Mafia, A Dream, a Temptation, and The Longest Night of the Second World War. Malcolm Gladwell, welcome to Kobo.
Thank you.
We are both products of a Southern Ontario childhood. You grew up in Elmira. I grew up in Fergus. They are almost equally sized small towns and are close enough together that the high school swim team that I was on used to practice at the Elmira pool because we did not have a pool of our own. Tell me a little bit about young Malcolm Gladwell.
I always thought Fergus was like the better version of Elmira. It was prettier, I think.
Elora was actually prettier than both. And then
Yeah.
Fergus was kind of next to the prettier thing.
Well, better than me what my childhood was like because we had the same childhood, it sounds like. I think it is just about the best place in the world to grow up. Small town Southern Ontario. It was, about as free of anxiety as is possible in the modern world. In the best Canadian way, everything worked. Institutions worked. Schools were good. Teachers were fantastic. Nobody beat me up or robbed the house, or I never felt that I was missing anything. I sort of felt the world that I was given as a child was sufficient, which I think is a wonderful thing to say if you grew up in a very, very small town.
And a rare thing.
Yeah. And it prepared me beautifully for the rest of the world, and which is something that I have become as I've gotten older deeply grateful for, was the kind of not the kind of moral preparation I think that it gave me to grow up in a community that takes religious values and ideas seriously. That we were growing up in the world of the Mennonites, one of the more admirable religious cultures I think in the world. Who are, really that, although I was not raised in a Mennonite church, that their approach to life has had a profound effect on me. To be surrounded by people who have very, very clear principles and act on them from a very early age is really that's a remarkable education to receive.
And I think one of the interesting things about that Mennonite community particularly is there's a set of beliefs, but also an absolute willingness to build structure around those beliefs. Organizations and institutions sort of spring up within those communities. And so it must have been interesting to be within that. I was surrounded by dour Presbyterian Scots in Fergus.
Yes,
so
Fergus.
A slightly different scene. So I have a bit of a picture in my head of what that life looks like, but you also have family in Jamaica that you would visit every year. And there was maybe no experience farther away from Elmira than Jamaica in the 1960s and 70s, full of politics and music and the drive towards independence. What was it like when you suddenly were transplanted from one to the other for a period of time?
It's funny. I was interviewing for one of our podcasts, Ziggy Marley, the other day, and Ziggy Marley, who's almost my age, but who spent a lot of time. He's also a product of Jamaica in the '70s, so our memories of Jamaica were very, very similar, except his Jamaica is Kingston. My Jamaica is the countryside, where my grandparents were. And there's a world of difference between my Jamaica was this sleepy, bucolic, it was a place, and my memories are of my grandparents, these two loving, warm, deeply kind of thoughtful people. It wasn't, simultaneously in Jamaica in that period, you're right, there are 5 different revolutions going on in Kingston. That's not what I was seeing, right? Reggae music is exploding, and, Michael Manley is bringing socialism to Jamaica, and crime rates going through the roof, and people are emigrating to Canada and the United States by the thousands. That's not what my Jamaica is a little house on top of a hill, and you can't, from my grandparents' front porch, you could not see another structure except church.
We could spend an hour just talking about the contrast between those two experiences and Elmira versus Fergus, but this is supposed to be about reading and writing. So tell me a bit about your reading life at that time when you were young and growing up.
Well, my mother would take me to the library every week, I think on Tuesdays or Wednesdays, I've forgotten which. And that was a central part of my life until my father started taking me to the University of Waterloo Library, and I would take out books from there. So I was surrounded with books. And it's, once again, to reflect on Canadian institutions, I didn't own any books. I didn't own books until I was at the end of high school. It was when I bought maybe had a handful of books. My world was of libraries, and it felt like I had thousands of books at my disposal. I was a voracious reader as a child, and I had these 2 really good libraries at my disposal that I used as aggressively as possible. And then before that, my father, who was a great reader, would read. He would read to us. So I was introduced to Dickens and C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and all these people from a very, very early age. And so I would, in retrospect, had an exceedingly bookish, and we had no television. My parents declined to get a television. So, you can imagine how even more central books were then to my imaginative life.
Once you were turned loose within these 2 libraries, were you focusing on particular subjects? Were you diving down into specific authors, or just ranging widely?
Reading a lot of history, but mostly, and a lot of kind of thrillers and things, but mostly reading pretty randomly. I don't know whether I had a kind of singular focus at that age. I just, you'd go to the library, and then they would have a shelf with all the new books that just came in, and I would often just pick one off that shelf and explore it.
You left home and went to university at the University of Toronto, and you've described university as not being a super productive time for you, and yet a man obviously possessing of great intelligence. So what didn't click there?
I'm going to quarrel with I think I probably did say that once. What I meant was, it was actually enormously productive, not in the way that I had anticipated. I didn't find my classes, with a few exceptions, terribly meaningful. But I did find the people that I met and talked to incredibly meaningful. So, which I realize is probably the point of college, that the people are ultimately more. By the end of college, my last 2 years of college, I stopped going to lectures. I just didn't I never liked lectures, and I just stopped going. So I wasn't getting out of it. There's a way to approach college. If I was going today, I would go to lectures. I mean, there's a way you would approach college as an adult that differs, I think, a lot from the way you approach it as an adolescent. I turned 17 in my first year of university. I was very young, and so I had perhaps a kind of idiosyncratic approach to my education. I liked doing things on my own, and that's a habit that, I went off. I wasn't that I was shirking my work. I just wasn't interested in being spoon-fed by professors.
But it had the effect of directly or indirectly of leading you into journalism, and not through the usual route of small daily paper, bigger daily paper, biggest daily paper. You packed up, left Canada, and started with the American Spectator, a conservative magazine in the American Midwest. When you look back on that part of your career, how important was that first job? And I'm not just thinking as a foot in the door of journalism, but as someone who I think has tried to tread a non-traditional journalistic path in a lot of ways.
Well, I was 20 when I started there, and it was a place where you could be a 20-year-old, and I had articles published for the American Spectator. Within a month of my arrival, so it was an insane opportunity, and it just kind of instilled in me the idea that people are far too timid, I think, about pursuing opportunities. I got there and turned out to be fine to write stuff. And so I started writing stuff and continued to write with them even after I left the American Spectator. I was fired, to be more.
Okay, pause for 1 second. Fired because?
I wasn't very happy in Southern Indiana, and I got into it a little bit with some of not my editor, who's a lovely person, but with some of the senior people at the magazine. It wasn't a good fit. I mean, I was much too young, but no, it was just I realized that you could just pursue things you wanted to pursue, and the world would usually accommodate you to one degree or another. So it kind of reinforced the lessons of my childhood, which is if you just do your own thing, things usually turn out all right. So that was important. It was the opposite of a traumatic experience. It was an inviting warm bath, my first job. And I think some people, it's funny, now that I have a company, we had this discussion. Many people talk about, their first jobs, how they still have PTSD from some job they've had. I never had a job that gave me PTSD. I was very lucky in that respect.
In Outliers, you popularized the notion of 10,000 hours as being the time it takes to achieve true expertise. When did you feel like you hit that stride for yourself as a journalist?
I mean, it was 10 years into. Mm-hmm. It was by the end of my time. I left the Washington Post, where I was for 10 years, because I felt that I had learned all that I could learn. But it did take 10 years for me to kind of master, to be able to write, to report quickly and efficiently, to write quickly and efficiently, to express myself clearly and succinctly. Those are all things that I learned at the Washington Post, particularly the reporting thing. How to, being a reporter is being a kind of entrepreneur in the sense that each story you do is a new creation and you have to figure out how to do it. And I learned that at the Washington Post, that you have to sit and think about what's the best way to approach this, and then hunt down people who will help you and be willing to turn on a dime and pursue a completely different tack if that's the right way to go. All those are things that you learn by doing. And I wrote hundreds of stories at the Washington Post. An astonishing number, probably even thousands. And so it was an incredible education. It was grad school. I mean, Bob Woodward, the greatest reporter of my generation, was 10 feet from me. I mean, if I wanted to, I could just stop and watch him. And I did, and learned an enormous amount just watching him operate. So it was, So yeah, by the end, after 10 years of that, I felt I knew what I was doing.
When you found your current journalistic home at The New Yorker, I think a lot of people have an idea of what a Malcolm Gladwell story looks like now. But how long did it take you to find your voice as a journalist there, to find the kind of story that worked for you?
It didn't take very long, but the kinds of stuff I was doing at the New Yorker were really kind of longer, more personal versions of things I had been doing at the Washington Post by the end.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't seem like that much of a departure. It was just all of a sudden I had 8,000 words as opposed to 3,000 words. And I had 2 months as opposed to 3 weeks or 2 weeks. And I could travel different places. It was just, I had more resources.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but I didn't feel like I was inventing anything when I was at the New Yorker. I just felt like that's what happens when you give somebody 3 times as many words. And that's what happens when you give them time is a big thing. If the economics of the job are such that you can spend 2 months on one story, you're going to get a different story, right? That's the whole point of the New Yorker is that, the whole business model is you get something exceptional if you give talented people more room. And that's really what was going on there. And I had an editor, a lovely editor, who was as whimsical as I was. So who encouraged me to be, anarchic or mischievous or all the kinds of things I like to be. So that was also a very lucky marriage.
And then when the tipping point came out in 2000, was that then just a further expansion of that frame? I have an 8,000 word frame, and now I have a 100,000 word frame.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Were there other authors that you looked to when you were starting that first book, when you were starting to look at, okay, how am I going to sustain this idea? How am I going to build this narrative out to this additional scope and scale?
I mean, I always give the same names, but they were very important. Janet Malcolm, the New Yorker writer, Janet Malcolm has been someone I've been reading my entire career. Not that I try to do what she does, because I don't think anyone can do what she does, but she just gives you confidence that stories can work at that length and with that level of ambition. Michael Lewis had the same effect on me. There was a period of my life when I was after Tipping Point, when I got very, very, very interested in Michael Lewis's writing and tried to study it and understand how he could do what he could do. More recently, David Grann at the New Yorker is another writer who is really an extraordinary storyteller. It's like anything. When you're in a craft, you study other craftsmen for kind of ideas and clues about how to do certain things or how not to do certain things. Sometimes the example is negative, that I don't want to do that. And I have that response as well.
What provoked that response?
There's a certain kind of science book now, which is study, story, study, or anecdote, study, anecdote, study, anecdote. And
Yes.
I really, really, really can't stand those books anymore. I wrote one myself. That's what the Tipping Point is. And I really don't like that way of writing books. I mean, I don't mean to suggest that they're bad, because some people, they're incredibly useful for many, many, many readers. I appreciate them. They are just not for me. I don't like leaning that heavily on academic research. I think you have to use it creatively. But I think the idea of just kind of lining up a series of studies in a row, explaining each one, is just not, to my mind, the way I want to tell stories.
Is it because it doesn't ask the next question? It doesn't push the material farther? It's essentially a series of citations?
I think it's asking more of these studies than they're prepared to give. I mean, these studies are not supposed to be the definitive answer on something. They're supposed to be insights into a question. And I think what you have to do is you have to use them as insight. But this is something that teaches us how to think about X. It is not something that settles the question. So I dislike it when their studies are used to settle the question. I think that's premature.
Since The Tipping Point, there have been 5 other books, and it seems like that cycle could have gone on for an entire career. You know, articles, a book every few years, but then you took this turn and added a new dimension to your output. Can you tell me how Pushkin Industries came about?
My friend Jacob, who had been running Slate Media, which had a big podcast business, Jacob asked me 6 years ago, did I want to do a podcast? And I said yes. And that's where revisionist history started. And then Slate lost interest in making podcasts. So Jacob said to me, why don't we just take revisionist history and the other podcasts that we have started at Slate and start our own company? And that's where Pushkin came from. It was Jacob's idea, and I joined him very happily. And now originally it was just me and Jacob and 2 others, and now it's 50 some odd people. So it's grown quite rapidly. But our real interest now is audiobooks. Mm-hmm. We want to reinvent the audiobook. I have caught the audio bug and realized that I'm almost more interested in telling stories with my voice than I am on the page. So I've sort of left behind that earlier stage in my career, and now I want to do things with sound.
And so when you talk about reinventing the audiobook, what doesn't work about the audiobook today?
Well, most of them, my own audiobooks in the past included, not to talking to strangers, but ones before that. I think they're embarrassing. It's just, you put a guy in a sound booth for 4 days and he just reads his text. Like, why would you do that? Why wouldn't you take advantage of the form? You have a form where, first of all, you're inside someone's ear, so you have an intimate position. And 2, why wouldn't you use all the tape that's available to you? So the Bomber Mafia, for example, I don't read you and then Curtis LeMay said and read you his quote. I go and find the tape and have Curtis LeMay tell you himself. You might as well, if we're going to do audio, let's hear everybody, right? Let's have music. Let's have archival tape. Let's take advantage of the medium. I mean, the equivalent would be somebody wrote an art book and doesn't have any pictures. Like, why would you have pictures? You're producing a book. The pictures are the one thing you can do. Have some pictures, right? Can you imagine if we had 100 years of art books and then suddenly in 2021, some upstart company came along and said, we're going to put pictures of the paintings we're talking about in the art book. And everyone was like, I've got this great idea. Turns out we can take a photo of the art and put it in the book, and you'll know what we're talking about. And we're like, whoa, what a radical concept. Well, we just think an audiobook should be more than someone reading in a sound booth.
So then have you approached the kinds of stories you do differently because you're thinking about them as something that lives in audio, like from a structural perspective, from a source perspective?
100%. 100%. Yes, that's the key. You put your finger on the key insight. Not every book has to be an audiobook. Mm-hmm. If I'm writing a book about, an analysis of the economic mistakes made by the Canadian government in the period 1990 to 2016, it's not an audiobook. There's no advantage to making that an audiobook.
Although someone will try.
Someone will try. But I want to have charts and graphs and all kinds of things that lend themselves to print. We're doing an audiobook with Paul Simon, the singer, songwriter. That's not a print book. Why would you do a print book on Paul Simon? We sat down with him for 40 hours. He plays for us. We found old archival tape. We talk to other musicians who he's a musician. So that's a perfect audiobook, right? Like, do an audiobook with a musician, do an audiobook with a comedian. he's got jokes to tell. You want to hear his voice or her voice. But don't do an audiobook with an economist. Why would you bother? So it's like, you're absolutely right. The question you start with the question, what is the natural home for the story I want to tell? Some stories, the Bomber Mafia works in both. I think it works as a book and it works as an audiobook, but they are very different. I mean, it is a completely different experience to listen to the audiobook of the Bomber Mafia than it is to read the physical book.
I was going to say, in the middle of the 5th season of Revisionist History, after an episode on a lost Van Gogh painting and an episode on the Bolivian elections, we suddenly meet the Bomber Mafia and Curtis LeMay. And there wasn't anything about that particularly that said, and now we are going to start a series of episodes that will become a book. Although it was clear you were working through a much larger story arc than summarizing the story of a lost Van Gogh. So what was the genesis of that story? And when did you know that it was something bigger that could use that larger frame of, living as a podcast, but then also being a standalone work on its own?
I think it's because I felt in the podcast, I had told the end of the story. I did 3 episodes on really the firebombing of Tokyo in March of 1945. But that is an episode in a much longer story that begins in the 30s. And so some part of me was dissatisfied when I finished those 3 episodes for my podcast, because I felt like I'm just nibbling at this. I haven't told you anything. I haven't told you how we got to Tokyo, right? I just plunked you down in the middle of Tokyo in Guam. And then I realized there was all this incredible tape of these characters. And there's this incredibly romantic thing about these guys at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. And I just said, there's just a much bigger, grander story here. So why don't I go back and do it again? Only this time at 5 times the length or 4 times the length. So it was just the story. It's just about this, all these things about, you get to know the story and you become friends with the story. And then you begin to understand the best way the story should live in the world. And this struck me as something that ought to live in the world at greater length. And that I'd written, like I said, written the ending. I needed the beginning.
Growing up as a kid in Southern Ontario in the 1970s and 80s, I was fascinated by the Second World War. There were people around who had fought in it and for whom it wasn't a distant memory. And it was closer historically then than Miami Vice episodes are to today. And it seemed like every library, every grown man's collections of books at home included books on the Second World War. It was everywhere. And yet this was a new story for me in a lot of ways. And so I'm wondering what made you latch onto this particular sort of series of historical episodes and decide that it needed more exploration.
Because it's rare. It has so many elements. The story has so many elements that are catnip. You have these 2 antagonists, Curtis LeMay and Haywood Hansel, these 2 very vivid, extraordinary characters who come into conflict. Not just conflict with each other, but conflict with themselves. So internal conflict as well. And you have this sort of group of outsiders, this group of renegades who are trying to reform what they believe to be a morally imperfect status quo. You've got a new technology that's promising a revolution. I could keep going. You rarely get a story. There are all these kind of natural storytelling elements. I'm going to do 1 episode of my podcast this season on the Los Angeles Police Department, and I intend to turn that into an audiobook. And it doesn't have the same elements, doesn't have technology, not, it doesn't have, but it has, as I think about the story and learn about it, the more I learn, the more I realize, oh, it has all these kind of mythic elements that you want in a story. It has these larger than life characters who are involved in kind of consequential conflict. It has, you know, it has a kind of an unknown hero. I could go on and on down the list. It takes, a lot of this has to do with place. You know, the Bomber Mafia, the book takes place in Guam. It takes place in over the skies of Japan, and it takes place in Montgomery, Alabama. And it takes place in the airfields of southern England in the middle of the Second World War. Those are all fantastic places for a story. And the LAPD story, it takes place not just in LA, but it takes place in different parts of LA. Like LA is really 5 cities, not one. And each of those cities has a role in the story. When you realize, oh, I can take you places, right? And those places are meaningful. Just as in the Bomber Mafia, Guam is supposed to come alive for you.
Mm-hmm.
There's a little bit of tape in the audio. I said it's in both versions, obviously, but in the audio version, it's incredibly poignant, where this woman who was a nurse on Guam describes what it was like to live in those huts with the rats running over your blankets at night. And just that little, hearing her many years later, remembering that detail, and you're realizing she's thousands of miles from home in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, involved in a war that she doesn't know how it's going to turn out. She doesn't know if she's going to get bombed by, and she's supposed to wake up at 6 a.m. and tend to the wounded, and there's rats running over her bed. It's like just gives you that one little detail just tells you so much about what people went through. That whenever you can bring that level of detail to a story, the story suddenly takes on another dimension.
For people that haven't encountered the book or the podcast yet, the Bomber Mafia describes this group of people who come together in a way to try and create this idea of precision bombing, that you don't have to level whole cities. You can in fact be very surgical about where bombs drop and use that as a way to hopefully end wars faster. And there were a couple of things that came up to me early in the book. At the very beginning, you described just how ludicrously difficult it is to drop a bomb on a target from the air. Mm-hmm. And so the premise of the Bomber Mafia was to do this thing that had really never been done before, for the first time, using new technology, using new bomb sites. And what I hadn't realized was that this belief began with the desire to avoid wanton destruction.
This all grows out of the carnage of the First World War. I think this is a generation that was so shaken by what happened and by the kind of senselessness of the slaughter in the First World War, that they were determined to do something about it. They did not want to repeat that experience. And the Bomber Mafia are a group who think that technology is the way out of that problem. The way to not have a First World War again is to fight the next war with a set of tools that allow us to behave with some degree of humanity, even as we are trying to defeat our opponent. So it's like it's hard for us today, I think. Now, these are guys, like I said, in the 1930s, and they're a group of people who are obsessed with airplanes at a time when the airplane is an exotic thing. It's not if you talk to an army general in of almost any army in the world in 1935, they would, and ask them about the potential of airplanes to transform warfare, they would have rolled their eyes. Just didn't. They thought the airplanes were interesting and novel and curious objects. They did not think that they would be organizing military campaigns around aircraft. Aircraft were these flimsy things made of wood and canvas, and it's ludicrous to these people to think that these little flimsy objects could play a big role. The Bomber Mafia disagreed, and were convinced that planes could advance to the point where they could not just dominate wars, but make every other form of fighting war obsolete. No more destroyers, no more tanks, no more infantry marching, no more heavy artillery, all gone. All you would need is a bomber, right? That's what these guys thought. And it's funny, and they're in Montgomery, Alabama. And I say this only because I was in Montgomery, Alabama yesterday. And you have to be in Montgomery, Alabama to go there to understand just the absurdity of this. It is the middle of nowhere, and particularly was the middle of nowhere in 1935. So a bunch of guys in the sleepiest town in the South are engaged in the grandest obsession of their era, right? It's fantastic. It's like, how can you not love that story?
You also do a wonderful job of describing just how absurd the war in the Pacific was during the Second World War. The incredible distances involved. The idea that no two combatants had ever faced each other from across such vastness. And then these guys were trying to figure out how to do a war within those constraints.
Yeah, it's without precedent. Japan knew nothing about the United States, relatively speaking. The U.S. knew nothing about Japan, relatively speaking. And the closest the United States can get to Japan is Guam, which is a good 1,500 miles away from Japan. And they can only get that close after 3 years of some of the most vicious fighting of the war. They start out, at the beginning of the war, the closest they can get is Hawaii. Hawaii is an awful long way from Japan. If you ever made that journey, it is like, so it's like the scale of this, we're fighting across the Pacific. I mean, it's just nuts in retrospect. And it never, now it's, now we don't think of much of these kinds of distances, but in 1943 or 44, these distances are serious impediments to doing anything. I mean, even if you chose to fight the war entirely on the sea, you would be sailing for weeks to get your fleet in place against Japan. Now we're talking about moving men and material and weapons and planes and mechanics and hospitals and nurses. I mean, on and on and on. Thousands of miles across the Pacific to a little tiny island called Guam, and setting up shop there. And, building they have to build airports out of the jungle, which they do in a matter of months. I mean, the whole thing is just, in retrospect, is insane.
The story comes to center on General Curtis LeMay, and he is the archetypal cigar chomping general. He may even be the reason we have that archetype. And he's been portrayed and characterized in various forms in movies and books ever since. But he becomes central to the story. And the subtitle of the book is A Dream, a Temptation, and the Longest Night of the Second World War. If the dream for LeMay and for the rest of the Bomber Mafia is precision bombing, tell me about the temptation.
In the back of their mind was the very real fear that they would never get it right. And if you don't get a strategy right in war, not only does your side lose, but your career is over. Right? The stakes are significant. There was another way for them to fight the war against Japan that was not morally directed. and they did not rely on a high stakes technological project, bomb the Japanese into oblivion. That was a temptation. Do you give up your ethical approach to try to reform war and just go back to the old ways of doing it, right? If you go back to the old ways, you'll probably win. You'll certainly get promoted. You'll be a hero, but you will slaughter hundreds of thousands of your enemy, civilians, right? Enemy civilians. That is a temptation along biblical lines. I bring in this Jesus in the desert and the devil offering him dominion over all he sees, if only he will pledge allegiance to the devil. That's the choice they were given, right? And it's not, it's an impossible choice, right? Do you want to win or do you want to stay true to your conscience?
Several people end up being faced with that choice in different ways over the course of the book. And LeMay was the one who crossed over that line, who decided that yes, this was the only way to do his job, to end the war as quickly as possible. Is the book about that crossing of lines and how when you cross them you have to adopt a whole logical framework that makes the next thing possible and the next thing possible and the next thing possible?
Yeah, I mean, the book is about the difficulty of squaring your conscience with problem solving. To me, everything that they're dealing with in this book, or everything they're dealing with in the bombing campaigns over Japan and Europe in the Second World War, are versions of moral arguments that are even more urgent now, right? Like, I fell in love with the Bomber Mafia because I felt like there aren't technologists like that today. Mark Zuckerberg is not agonizing about the moral dimensions of his innovation the way the Bomber Mafia were. And I kind of wish he did. I don't know whether that would produce a different outcome, but I would feel comforted by the idea that he was at least entertaining those sorts of moral questions in his approach.
One thing that struck me about LeMay, and especially about the last segment of the book, was how little official strategy was behind what he did. Once he had figured out the hammer, which was we can use incendiary weapons on Japanese cities, he just started hammering nails. And how few people in Washington, D.C. and the leadership of the Allies knew what he was up to. And so over the summer, he destroyed all of these cities. And you suggest that it wasn't necessarily because they didn't know what was happening. It was that they couldn't imagine it. They couldn't conceive of what was being done.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like it wasn't showing up in reports. It didn't land for them.
Something happens when we're immersed in that kind of trauma for too long. And at the end of the Second World War, something happens where LeMay goes on this kind of murderous rampage across Japan. And in the summer of 1945, bombs 66 Japanese cities, killing hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians. And as you say, it's like, it's his own project. It's not something that anyone in Washington seems to realize is happening. He's just off on his own in the middle of, he's like Kurtz in Apocalypse Now. He's off on his own, just launching one napalm attack after another on Japan. It's nuts in retrospect. He's just hammering away. And the human costs of that hammering are appalling, truly appalling. And I think it's about this kind of fatigue that takes place at the end of these. We're seeing on a this is a dumb analogy, but I sort of feel like there's a version of this now going on now with the pandemic, that once fatigue sets in, it's just like all bets are off. You know what I mean? Like I don't think it's any coincidence that the United States right now is having this string of mass shootings. after not having them for quite some time. We've had one a day for the last, whatever it is, 10 days, a week, I can't remember. Just like everyone's at the end of their tether. And that's a minor version. Well, everyone's at the end of their tether at the end of the Second World War. And crazy stuff started to happen. And LeMay was just kind of unhinged.
He was essentially indifferent to the nuclear attacks on Japan. You describe it as they were someone else's job. And that seems crazy until you realize that he's essentially burning down a city every night.
Yeah. I mean, whatever qualms he may have had about the wholesale slaughter of Japanese civilians were thoroughly extinguished by the early summer of 1945. So when the 2 atomic bombs were dropped in August, I mean, do you think Curtis LeMay lost a single moment of sleep over that? No. I mean, he was like, "What? You guys, you don't understand what you guys did with the atomic bomb. What I've been doing all summer is that you dropped 2 bombs and I dropped thousands. But it's the same thing, same effect. We're just burning down cities." I mean, it's to his mind, and I think could totally understand where he's coming from. I don't. Is there a moral distinction between dropping 1 atomic bomb on Hiroshima and dropping 10,000 canisters of napalm on Tokyo? No, it's the same thing.
The book ends before the next chapter in LeMay's life, when he becomes the architect of Strategic Air Command and, by extension, America's nuclear strategy. He was a key figure in the Cuban Missile Crisis. His name is synonymous with the idea of mutually assured destruction. And all of this from a person who had begun with this idea of precision and ended in this place of essentially annihilation. Do you think that all of that flowed from that first decision about bombing Tokyo? Like it really, he left the dream behind.
LeMay was just never a part of that. I don't think he had the imagination, the moral imagination, to think that war could be transformed in a way that made it more kind of ethically palatable. What I think his wartime experience does is, as I said before, extinguish whatever remaining qualms he may have had about the wholesale slaughter of civilians. I mean, I don't really go into Korea much, but if at all, I can't remember. The Korean War makes the Second World War look like a picnic. The U.S. Air Force in Korea reduces an entire country to rubble, burns it down with napalm. In fact, the bombing ends in North Korea because they run out of targets. The Air Force quite literally says, we can't do any more bombing because we have nothing left to bomb. Imagine that, right? And then we wonder why the North Koreans are so antagonistic towards us. Well, we did reduce their entire country to rubble just 70 years ago.
Going back to something you said earlier about this being a book about technology, one of the things that comes through is the sense of how difficult it is to see the ramifications of technology in advance. Certainly the people who were working on testing napalm in the middle of a soccer field at Harvard had no sense of what they were unleashing in the world. When you think about people like Mark Zuckerberg, about the people that are leading social media companies, about the people that are collecting and storing, manipulating personal data, are we in that same headspace of we can certainly see what we're working on and what we're tinkering with, but we don't have sense of what the world looks like after we've unleashed it?
The least trustworthy predictions about the future come from the people who are driving the future. So if you want to know about what our social media landscape looks like, the last person you should ask is Mark Zuckerberg. Is going to look like. He's a prisoner, appropriately, I suppose, of his own little universe, right? He's trying to do Facebook. That's been an issue over and over again. I have an episode of my podcast in the season of Revisionist History that's all about autonomous vehicles and all about, without giving it away, about how the people pushing autonomous vehicles have one very, very large blind spot about the limitations of them. And I don't really fault them for it. That's how innovators work. Nothing that makes you a good innovator also makes you good at diagnosing blind spots in your own passion, right? It's like other people have to do that. So when I say that I think this book is about today, it is because the kind of quagmire, moral quagmire, everyone gets caught up in at the end of the Second World War, that's similar to the kind of quagmires we get caught up in now all the time, because we're now innovating on a scale far greater than they were back in the 1940s during the war. So these things are going to pop up every time we turn around.
Malcolm, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. It's been really fun.
I've been speaking with Malcolm Gladwell about his new book and audiobook, The Bomber Mafia. Find it and the other books we've talked about here, along with previous episodes of the show, at kobo.com/conversation, or check the show notes. Make sure to catch every conversation by subscribing wherever you listen, and leave us a review because it helps other readers find us. Kobo in Conversation is produced by Nathan Maharaj and hosted by me, Michael Tamblyn. Thank you for listening.